I want to welcome everybody to a 10 a.m. panel, our legal panel, Blazing New Paths Legally and Ethically, and I'll also say, and mindfully, as our panelists will soon show why that's important. We do have 4 panelists today, and I want to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. I would try, but their resumes are so long and so impressive with so many long terms that I couldn't get through it, so I'm going to hand it off to them. So Dr. Pinker, why don't we start with you and your introduction?
Wonderful. Thank you, Lee, and thanks to you all for being here. My name is Lori Pinkert. I'm an associate professor of writing and rhetoric at the University of Central Florida, where I also direct our Writing Across the Curriculum program in the Center for Writing Excellence. So as you might imagine, my work dovetails with some of the issues we'll be discussing today in terms of preparing both current and future teachers to engage with a host of issues they're facing in the classroom and that their students are bringing with them to the classroom. Thank you.
Excellent, and welcome. Dr. Beaver.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. I'm glad to be here. I'm Associate Professor of Ethics and Digital Culture here at the University of Central Florida, and I direct our UCF Center for Ethics. So all of my work is on ethics and emerging technology and its intersections.
Excellent. And Dr. Garone.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to the panel. Really a pleasure to be here. My name is John Guerin. I'm a faculty member at Nova Southeastern University Shepherd Broad College of Law. My focus, I started as an entertainment lawyer. My focus is on the intersection of content and regulation. So First Amendment, intellectual property, copyright, and basically all of the areas that we've been talking about today.
Excellent. And finally, but certainly not least, Dr. Ravitch.
Good morning, Professor Ross. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here and with all of the panelists. My name is Timothy Ravitch. I'm an associate professor at the University of Central Florida in the Department of Legal Studies. I'm also a lawyer with the law firm of Tressler. Much of my focus is on aviation law, which is to say data, drones in the new space, basically flying airplanes. So I'm looking forward to a robust conversation, and we'll further develop, hopefully, my contributions that way.
Well, thank you all so much. Again, I'm Lee Ross. I'm a professor in the Department of Criminal Justice here at the University of Central Florida. I've been here for 20 years. I've been in the academy for over 31, 32, if you will. I do a lot of research on domestic violence and the criminal justice system, and also talk about race, crime, and justice, and a lot of nefarious publications. So anyway, so let's get started. For me, ethics in our discipline are so important. We're not so much concerned with our students learning the ins and outs of criminal procedure as we are with their behavior on the job. Can they do what's right when you should do right? So just that in a nutshell. So my first question to the panelists, all of you, is what is it about your current position or research interests that attracts you to this issue? We'll start with you, Dr. Pinkert.
So I think I've been encountering the topics we're discussing today, so both in terms of artificial intelligence and the way that it's shaping what we can communicate, how we can communicate, whether and to what extent humans are involved in the processes of communication. I mean, I think that's really shaping questions that teachers have about how to do what they know to do in the classroom, and sort of how that impacts workplace needs and expectations as technology is evolving right alongside the teachers who are already in the classroom and the students. I think there are a lot of questions there. I also have been working with industry partners, thinking about how to train their employees for the communication tasks that are at hand with new technologies. So again, as a writing person, I think my intersection has been primarily with, in terms of AI, with text generative tools and what they can do. So that's what's drawn me here.
Good enough. What about you, Dr. Beaver?
I think as an ethicist, I'm interested in the cyclical nature of these things. From my perspective, that what's happening right now with AI is a relatively old story, right? We've got all kinds of instances of big data-driven research leading to money functionally, leading to some big public reveal or public recognition, leading to regulation and litigation driven by ethical failures. And then there's all this secondary derivative use. And I think that's where my interest lays now. Like after the OpenAI reveal, the public reveal, there are lots of these specific intelligences being developed. And that's where all the interesting work is being done. What's happening at the derivative use stage. So that's what draws me in, I think.
Excellent. And Dr. Giron.
Yeah, thank you. So I shifted from being purely entertainment and media lawyer to technology lawyer in 1994 with the introduction of the graphical user interface for the web, right? So I've been playing in this space for a long time, and we've seen this tremendous shift as we go through the various iterations of the internet, online communication, social media, and now generative AI. But I'm one of the few lawyers who will channel Marshall McLuhan in terms of, right, every change in media changes the message, changes actually the culture. The media shapes the culture as much as shaped by it. And so my scholarship really focuses a lot on how those secondary effects look at the world. But as a technical attorney, I also have been writing about deep fakes, disinformation, cyber warfare, and these issues for the last 10 years. And so there's a host of very big and very little issues that are going on.
Excellent. And Dr. Ravitch, what draws you to this panel?
Sure, I think about this question in, I think, two dimensions. One is professional and one is personal. So first on the personal/professional side, I'm an educator in two dimensions. I'm a father of two young daughters, and I worry as one's a pre-K, one's still not in school. I worry about, they both have iPads. How lucky little girls. I worry about that and how I'm going to sort of impart education within my household. Obviously, as a professor too in the classroom, I worry a lot about how students are answering my tests, whether they are in fact answering the tests, and those sorts of questions that I think are intuitive and known to really everybody here. On the professional side, part two, as a practicing lawyer, one of the famous cases about ChatGPT gone wrong was in fact an aviation lawyer who cited Supreme Court precedent to a court that anybody who knew anything about the subject knew this doesn't make sense. This brief doesn't make sense. And so as a lawyer, we're struggling to see AI and generative technologies as helpful, but where are the limits, which is, I think, going to be a theme that we all talk about.
Excellent. All right. Let's get started here. So what are the challenges and ethical considerations posed by AI? Some of the challenges. Dr. Giron, let's start with you.
Oh, there are so many challenges. Well, I'll try and focus on education because, again, some of my writings on national security and the election, where we can go anywhere with that conversation. But one of my biggest concerns is that we currently, and this kind of, I'm sure, ties into Dr. Pinker's work, we use writing as a surrogate for teaching critical thinking, digital literacy, and analysis. And so we as educators need to unbundle the steps that make critical thinking a competency and realize they're separate competencies, because if the crafting of the sentence has become automated, then so much of that critical thinking process has been taken away from the student. And unless we do that work, the previous panel, I really enjoyed the previous presentation, but the reality is there was a consequence to calculators. Industry had to automate cash registers because we can no longer employ people who can make change. We have, in fact, stripped society of the ability to subtract from 100. And so there is a consequence to technology, and it's going to really affect the way people write, the way they shape communication. And if we don't become really smart about teaching critical thinking, it's going to have a profoundly negative effect on how we educate the young.
Wow, excellent. Dr. Ravitch, what do you think?
Some lawyers, I hope I'm not one of them, and in legal education, fancy themselves as special, that there's something known as thinking like a lawyer, that's somehow different than thinking like other professions. And so in legal education, which is obviously where I'm situated, there's a big focus on thinking for yourself, on analytical skills. And the idea of having answers at the ready defeats that, right? One of the best things for law students is to have a professor put the microphone right in your face and have to think on your feet. These technologies are, I think, to Professor Guerin's point, largely making that unnecessary. And that's, as he says, there are consequences to that.
Excellent. Dr. Pinkert?
Yeah, I might just follow up on those 2 points to suggest that AI is really, I think, complicating something that's already complicated, I think, particularly in our sort of national landscape and discourse, but notions of expertise and what the value of expertise is and what its parameters are. And in some cases, it's masking, right, the types of information that are put into the data sets that are used to train the AI tools. And so it becomes nearly impossible. I sat in on a session with a computer scientist last week who was saying it is, in some cases, impossible to know exactly why you got the output you did from the AI tool that you used. I mean, there are just so many variables there. And so I think to the 2 previous points, literacy skills are becoming even more crucial at a time when there is financial investment, right, in masking where the sources have come from or the numbers of sources that are being used to train the AI tools, et cetera. So I think it's made it really complicated for users of tools to know exactly what input is being drawn out on the tool that they're using.
Interesting. Dr. Bieber?
Yeah, thanks. Just to add on to my colleagues, I'll go big picture to some principles. The things that interest me most in terms of ethical challenges are informational harms. We've got a longstanding legal framework of dignitary harms like battery and assault and false imprisonment and things. These are bodily, but the extension of our information out into digital worlds means informational harms are becoming a bigger part of the ethical landscape, and I assume the legal landscape. Things like privacy are being changed and challenged, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But then there's also, and I heard the last speaker mention this too, there's also environmental concerns. Everything from emissions and mining materials to run the servers that run the tools, but also then the use of tools to, say, increase fossil fuel production, find new mining sites. There's an exacerbation factor that happens around environmental concerns. And then just a second, Dr. Pinkert's point, I think explicability is a really interesting epistemic concern that couples to the ethical issues. Our capacity to explain what's going on, understand our sourcing, and the fundamental truth of the claims we're making is being challenged more and more as technologies, big data technologies like AI and large language models develop. And that worries me. I just read recently that in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a tenfold increase in science publishing issues. So junk science being published and being captured just in the scientific community. So the very well-known scientific journal Nature has had a tenfold increase in its retractions. And that's one journal, one very well-known journal, and that's happening across the globe, across journals, just in one area. I think that's a significant concern. So informational harms, environmental concerns, and explicability, those are my big 3.
Excellent. So collectively, it looks like you all have some serious concerns about, I guess, the integrity of AI. And it's almost like we're dumbing down a lot of the things that we expect people to learn on their own, if you will. Secondly, what ethical and legal considerations should an institution like UCF be addressing regarding the use of AI in the development of courses? You're developing a new course, and you're going to use AI in its development. What are some ethical and legal considerations that you should be mindful of? Dr. Guerin.
Sure. Again, it's a very long list. So we can start. So if I understand the question, we're starting with, I'm a faculty member. I want to create a new course. where does AI fit into that conversation? It's a great tool for brainstorming, right? Because I'm not all negative on AI either. So it's a great tool for brainstorming. Can use it to think about the first set of questions that I'd want for that particular course. I cannot draw. I wish I could. And so I love using AI generated imagery to illustrate what I do. But we have to be mindful that the images that we're generating, just because they're created by an AI system, doesn't mean they're not unintentionally duplicating copyrighted work that was ingested as part of the creative process. So, in a classroom setting on Canvas, there's also protections for academics and fair use. But if you're going to be publishing materials, moving to a publisher, then that really creates questions. And so if you use, right, there are indemnifications from Microsoft and Google, but if you look carefully, those indemnifications require very careful prompt development. Once we move to the students, if the students are being asked to use an AI in the classroom, just as the previous speaker talked about FERPA issues and privacy issues with regard to their Turnitin software, which has largely been litigated and found acceptable. No one has yet litigated what goes into ChatGPT or these other programs. Confidential information, either institutional or if you're in a business program, confidential information that you're sharing with an AI is the essentially publishing that information. So you want to have clear safeguards about what content you're uploading. And if you're asking students to upload their personal information, I think that is both potentially a FERPA issue, but I'm much more concerned with the ethical issues of asking students to share potentially deeply personal historical information on a published website. There are many, many more when we get to copyright licensing with the university, but I think that's enough to start.
That's a start for it. Okay, Dr. Pinker, what do you think? You designed this course. What are you concerned with?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo some of those concerns about compulsion. I think that's something that I'm concerned about. There are students who do not want to put, and maybe it's personal information, but maybe they also have a sense of, and we've tried to train students to think about themselves as the holders of their intellectual property, right? So our librarians, for example, have worked really hard to echo to students the importance of that. And so to ask them to put that in. I think on the flip side, we have faculty who are feeding students information into these machines without disclosing that sometimes to students in the ways that they're using. So that concerns me.
Interesting. Dr. Beaver.
I feel like I'm going to be real super grumbly here because that's my want. I think my grumbling has to do not so much with the legal, but the ethical, and we should talk about like generational differences. But here's my grumble, right? Dr. Guerin pointed out, rightly so, that like Turnitin and these machines have been litigated and found acceptable. But the model that all those work on is the same model as our large language models. We are willingly often giving up our information for the sake of some relatively minimal return. And in return, the corporation that drives these things is making a tremendous profit. This is the model that Turnitin, right? We willingly give up our students' data. That lets them develop a better tool to sell back to us for what is functionally a minimal return, something we could do on our own. And this is the model of, like, on my grumbly read, every sort of big data technology out there now, from Google and Microsoft to OpenAI, Turnitin. I mean, this is the sort of information ecosystem we live in right now. And I'm interested to see whether or not our students start to pick that up, right? I've seen a generational jump already. There was a sort of digital native generation that didn't seem to care as much, but my youngest generation of students seem to be more wary of giving up information in that way. So it's definitely not a legal concern, or it isn't yet a legal concern, but it, for me, is an ethical concern.
If I can just jump back in for a second, because I think what Dr. Beaver said is extremely important. Turnitin, the quid pro quo that the court found valid for fair use was its use of the student information was directly for student evaluation for purposes of identifying plagiarism. Nothing in that opinion suggests that Turnitin has a freedom to license that back to OpenAI or anyone else. And I think to Dr. Beaver's point, right, I was deeply offended by the Google Books decision that said all authors could be consumed because it was good for Google and therefore good for the world. And I think that in 2024, we are in a very different place than we were in 2012. And we now know that what was good for Google was good for the world was no different than better living through chemicals or other sloganeering that has been very harmful to society.
Excellent. Dr. Ravitch, do you mind if we go to the next question? Unless
Not
you
at
have...
all, please.
Okay, okay, great. And we'll start with you. What alternatives do you have as a professor have to assign the materials and how they should create a culture of inquiry while meeting your teaching obligations?
So I think there are a number, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
I'm saying, what alternatives do teachers have to assign materials, and how should they create a culture of inquiry while meeting their teaching obligations?
So I think, I'm generally positive on the technology, to be frank, and I think transparency is maybe the starting point, which is to acknowledge the elephant in the room. I have in my law and technology class, just as an example, allowed students to use a ChatGPT, or we bring it into the classroom to see what it looks like, and then try to use our own minds to critique where it's complete, where it's incomplete, and dissect what the technology is useful. So I don't think we want to insult the intelligence of students by suggesting this doesn't exist. It does, and we're all in the world together. Is why we have a shared interest in teaching each other, frankly. So I think that's one opportunity, depending on the class topic, to actually engage with the technology in a collaborative way. But so I think education is better than regulation in this respect. But there does need to be some regulation too. And even there, you can have students take on assignments or roles to sort of self-discipline or self-certify that they're doing the right thing. And I think professors have the same transparency obligations to say, here's where this information came from.
All right. I like your feedback on this scenario that actually happened to me last semester. A student submitted an essay, take-home essay. The Turnitin.com had a certain index matching score that I was concerned about, but I wasn't as concerned about it as AI-generated score. I said, you know what? This is very high. It says 63% of your essay was AI-generated. Like, what do you say? And the student, who's a military person, by the way, swore on a stack of Bibles that it wasn't AI. So my question was, gee, what do? Do you pursue this issue? Is it worth your time pursuing it or what? How would either of you handle that situation? And it was verbatim, by the way, verbatim.
So I might just jump in for a minute here just to
Sure.
say that what the AI detection tools are measuring are two things called perplexity and burstiness, right? They're both statistical terms. So it's measuring statistically how likely it is that an AI could generate the same kind of a text. There's no database like we have with Turnitin. We did the same thing for writing across the curriculum workshops. I had a GA who wrote 3 essays, fed them into 4 different detectors. And the one she wrote, it spit back and said it was 100% or 90% AI.
Right.
It was the one she wrote. So I think with those tools, they are not reliable. And some of the companies that have hosted them are closing them down because, in fact, they aren't. And in fact, they disadvantage students who are still learning to write in the genres and forms that we expect sometimes. I'll use myself as an example, right? I can't remember how to conjugate the future tense very often in Spanish. So my patterns are very routine. Yo voy a, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something. And that would get struck down, right? As not very human. And I think this becomes problematic too, because human writers are at a range of levels and write very differently as a first-year law student, an exiting law student, a first-year freshman, etc. So I think it's occasion for conversationally to talk about it. I would not rely on a detector personally. And I've seen the harm. My student, who is a writing student, it thinks I write like a robot. It was very detrimental and emotional to her. She is not a native English speaker. And so that also has been shown. The research is starting to show that there is some disadvantage to our non-native English speakers.
And Professor Lee, could I jump in for a quick second?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I liked Professor Pinkert's use of the word masking. And the way I interpret that is I always had math teachers would say, show your work, right? And there's no harm in doing that. It can be a diplomatic way without breaching trust or making someone feel defensive. It's just show me, did you outline when you wrote? Show me your sources. Where'd you get this from? And certainly, Professor Lee, you don't need advice from me, but it is always tricky to confront a student. And I think show me your work to the under the rubric of masking is something that could be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts before we go on? All right, let's take a deeper dive. In regard to ethical challenges, how concerned are you about the following statement? Number one, that AI is not neutral. AI-based decisions are susceptible to inaccuracies, discriminatory outcomes, and embedded or inserted bias. AI is not neutral. Dr. Garone?
So that is simply a truism. The question is not, is AI biased? The question that we do have to bear in mind is in comparison to what, right? So now we're switching, I think it's important to understand we're switching from discussions of generative AI to predictive AI. So we're looking at algorithmic decision-making. What does it feed us in our Netflix queue? Which is annoying, but irrelevant, but not highly important. To the example I gave in class yesterday was the same bias tool is telling us that people who look like us tend to live in this neighborhood, and people who look like somebody else tend to move in that neighborhood. And so the housing options that the AI generates are going to, in fact, violate the Fair Housing Act because of the implicit bias in that system.
Right.
We have to have structural safeguards. The Biden administration in October issued the longest ever executive order that, among its many things, has instructed the appropriate agencies in health, human services, FTC, and the like, over 50 different entities, to look for those kind of issues, issue guidance, right? Because that's already illegal. So it's just a matter of issue guidance where it's not illegal to issue regulations. But at the same time, this is the mixed bag. We know that in fair housing, right now, there are incredible biases that exist in valuations of properties, the ability of agents, and all the intermediaries in terms of housing. And so it may be that a well-designed tool can overcome, while not necessarily all of the biases in the system, it can do better than the humans are. And so we have to look at it not as a zero-sum game, but are we making incremental improvements?
But those biases have existed forever. How would AI remarkably improve upon it?
So one of the things, and I think it was mentioned earlier, perhaps in the earlier program, is we are moving to different kinds of training data. And so as we move to synthetic training data, we can identify an idyllic state, right? A utopian state of housing, which quite frankly doesn't exist in any city in America. But say that, right, the data suggests that race, economic status, gender are in fact neutrally distributed across the data training set. And so the AI model then is looking to promote neutrality. And so by redesigning very intentionally, and this goes back to the transparency, clearly, transparently, and intentionally, what we are teaching the tool to do, then it can push responses that model that.
Gotcha. Dr. Viva, I read one of your articles recently about your concern about what's posted online in various media platforms, like influence policy and how it's biased and how it may not be totally accurate or valid. How do you respond to this issue? It's not entirely neutral.
Yeah, I think, yes, I think I'll just second Dr. Garin and say, yes, of course, right? It's not neutral, that's the nature of design and decision-making. But I think my biggest worry with digital technologies and with AI specifically of all its various kinds is that things are moving faster and more broadly. And so what's happening is an exacerbation of existing issues. Lee, you said that bias has been around forever, right? That's just sort of part and parcel of our decision-making capacities. Those are embedded in our technologies, and we've come to a point where we can recognize those in our interpersonal decision-making. But once technologies increase in their speed and scope, it's harder to get a handle on, and they show up more places with more subtlety, perhaps. And that exacerbation is what worries me more than anything. So I think in an earlier conversation, we were thinking about the place of digital literacy and coupling both for our faculty colleagues and our industry partners, but also for our students, coupling this idea of digital literacy with an idea of ethical literacy is really important to me. Understanding how our technologies work and their implications, both short-term and long-term, is the only way I can see to handle these risks, which aren't going to go anywhere.
So they're self-perpetuating.
Yeah, maybe the self-perpetuating, but again, I think they just spread so ubiquitously with technologies like this. I started our conversation with my first remark saying that there are all these instances of implementations of technologies like generative and predictive AI, and those specific implementations, that's where the subtlety creeps in. On our campus right now, a few years ago, the UCF Police Department, in collaboration with a private entity, rolled out license plate recognition technologies, which is, visual AI, database, big data. And the initial thinking was, oh no, we've mitigated the ethical risk. Just had a conversation with our parking officials, administrators, and they said, oh no, when this is scaled up, there are all these risks that we didn't think of initially, but that technology is out there being used right now. And that's just one really specific, not even AI use of big data.
Gotcha. Dr. Pinker and Dr. Rabbit, I'm going to go on to the next question, if you don't mind. My question is, how concerned are you about surveillance practices for data gathering and privacy of court users? Dr. Rabbit, that seems to be closer to your area of research.
Thank you.
Concerned are you about surveillance practices for data gathering and privacy of court users?
So 10 out of 10, I think. There's a professor at the University of Utah School of Law who is a formidable thinker in this area, and something that he once told me in my class was, it's not that the violation of privacy is so concerning. It is, of course. It's that people even think they have privacy at this point, which sort of dovetails into the conversation we had about people voluntarily putting so much information out there. The privacy concerns are significant and touches on at this point, it's a cliche, which is that, the law lags technology, and it probably should. I don't know that we want regulators necessarily ahead of innovation, but the privacy concerns are significant and serious in academia, in practice, and it's not clear what courts or lawmakers really can do about it, in my opinion.
Okay, excellent. Dr. Leichert.
Yeah, I think issues of surveillance and privacy, I think prevail across domains. And so I think about them for our students who are in our classes. And you all may be aware, a university was recently in the news for rolling out AI bots that were going to be enrolling in classes and progressing through classes. They have names, they're doing research on them. And it was the first time that I thought, as a faculty member, is this what's coming, right? Am I going to be teaching a class that's, you know, half human students and half bots? And what will be done with the information collected by the bots in my class? So with good intention, right, we're improving teaching, things like that. But what else will be done? So it was one of those moments for me that I hadn't had before. And then what else are we training and teaching the tools to do? I think, you know, job questions have come up persistently across sectors. So I think there are those surveillance questions, those privacy questions. And I think it's hard to know when my information is out there. And what it's being used to do. So I think another transit related example, I rented a rental car and wanted to try to pay the toll, right? I had used my own transponder and wanted to pay tolls. If you live in anywhere in Central Florida, right, you know how many toll roads we have. And when I went on there, I logged in with the license plate number. I could see everywhere that car had been. And it struck me for the first time that I could put John's license plate number in, and presuming he has a transponder, I would have had access to everywhere he had been. I mean, it was striking. So surveillance and privacy in action.
Wow.
And we don't know that data is being collected, stored, and then shared in those ways.
That's news to me. Thank you. Can anyone provide insight as to how AI systems lead to job displacement? Because that's one of the allegations levied against it.
So I'll jump in, but I want to just take a second and talk about the privacy side too,
Okay.
because we tend to think about the data we share, and to a lesser extent, the license plate information, the car information is a great example of the information that's collected about us. But the executive order identified things like our gait. I do work on the metaverse. There is a study that your interaction with your keyboard and computer, you can be personally identified after roughly 15 seconds of use with the camera off, just based on the way you type and interact with your machine, not using facial, eye, other kinds of recognition. So the number of ways we track people is becoming overwhelming and not in any way transparent. So now tie that into the question of employment, and there's just a host of concerns. The first is the use of pervasive tracking tools in employment settings. So your camera must be on if you're a remote worker. Your eye movements are tracked. The place your browser goes is being tracked. And there are many companies that have a mandatory 10% cut policy, which means if you're the lowest part of the bell curve in your employer, you will lose your job even if you're very efficient, because 90% of the people are more efficient than you. And so it is impacting people's health and welfare directly. But then there's the other end, and this is the entertainment lawyer in me, which is my bigger fear is not the failure of these systems. My biggest fear is their success, right? As we move to intellectual property free music, to self-generating anime, where we have had a system create the content. It was suggested that 90% of animation costs can be eliminated through the use of AI. Well, that means 90%, almost all of that cost is payroll, which means that 90% of the workforce that's involved in creative animation at the top animated studios. Now, again, most of that work's already been outsourced, so it's not necessarily top level jobs at first. Right. But the greatest fear is, quite honestly, the existential threat that we won't develop musicians, writers, filmmakers, artists, because it is too efficient to just rely on these tools. And so we'll lose the next generation of great voices.
And you'll probably lose a lot of creativity in the process.
Exactly.
Would anyone add to that before we go into the next segment? Because it's kind of important that we get there. Unless you want something critical to add to John's statement.
Yeah, Lee, if I could,
Yes, please.
John made me think of the SAG-AFTRA strike. I mean, I think unions play
Right.
groups of people standing up and say, we recognize the risk here. We're going to negotiate to make sure this risk is mitigated. I don't know how successful that'll be in the long term, but that was a really important moment for me just to sort of see a group stand up and say, we see this.
Gotcha. I think we can all relate to that. Wow. All right. Changing gears here for a second. What type of legal challenges can be expected because the recent legislation passed by the Florida legislature in the next few years? And these are issues concerning banned books or HB 7, the Stop Woke Bill Act, or post-tenure review, or elimination of DEI. Let's start with banned books. What legal challenges can we expect? Let's start with Dr. Pinkert, if you would.
Yeah, Lee, I think one of the interesting things that I'll be watching to see how this plays out is
Okay.
the ways that we will see things from multiple sides being litigated, perhaps simultaneously moving through the channels, right? So it seems to me in some arenas we're hitting a point where various entities, right, enact rules, behaviors, etc., waiting for things to be legally challenged. And so we see that playing out. But I know I'm hearing from school boards, right, that they have folks on the picket line because they are banning a book, and on the picket line because they're not banning a book. And so I'm really curious to see how that plays out. And I think we've seen sort of overturnings happening in various ways. So I'm curious about how that plays through.
Okay. Dr. Ravitch, with banning books and one of the other issues?
It's an uncomfortable issue, and so maybe I'll just try to be objective about it, which is kind of my answer. Legislative houses are going to obviously try to propose laws that they think will satisfy their constituents, and so people can be on both sides of that. You can see the other side as bad or good or bad, and so I'm not so concerned about that. By that, I mean, that's what legislators do. It's the courts that I focus on a little bit more, and having courts that are going to apply, the rule of law faithfully, sort of like Justice Roberts of the Supreme Court said, an umpire in baseball just calling balls and strikes. Now, it brings a technology issue, to point, because computers are probably better at calling balls and strikes than maybe human beings, and yet we have human beings in courts. And so really for the issue of book bans, the First Amendment is implicated. How are courts going to decide this? Are they going to be, to use the term that's come up here a number of times, are they going to be the guardrails on legislation that people of both sides of the political spectrum think have gone too far? To be determined.
Okay. Dr. Beaver.
Lee, I appreciate the question, and you've asked a legal question of a philosopher, so this is probably not going to go the way that either John or Timothy would want. I don't know. I was trained to critically engage arguments, and so I think anything that gets in the way of my capacity, or even purports to get in the way of my capacity to lead students through critical engagement of multiple angles of an argument, seems problematic to me, just via my training. But I'm also a kid who grew up a big fan of George Carlin, right? And the idea that there are 7 dirty words you can't say on television in the 70s became a critical moment to sort of question, which is Carlin's whole kick, question norms and standards. I mean, I think that is a really important part of our American experience, is this capacity to engage. The political back and forth, like I have nothing to say about that. I think it's in the way of that critical engagement, and it will shake itself out. But again, Coming from the George Carlin side of philosophy, more engagement is better.
I remember him. Dr. Garone, what do you say, if anything? I don't know.
Yeah, so a couple additional thoughts. I find this movement deeply disturbing. I'm not going to be neutral on this. And I find it deeply disturbing for a number of reasons, particularly in the K-12 system. The notion that books randomly appear or appear because some activist thinks it should be on the bookshelves is so far from the reality. You have a lot of professionals in the faculty, in the school district, in the library who are making very informed decisions about what goes and shouldn't go in the library system. So to politicize that and turn it into a punching bag for the populist thought du jour really undermines the value and validity of our education professionals. And you combine that with the fact that I believe the statistic is that Florida is the second lowest paying state for public educators in the country. That combination of we simply want to essentially destroy or invalidate public education has so many social consequences, right? So if you are a family of wealth, you solve this problem through privatization. And one of the complementary laws to this was to make it easier to get funding to use state dollars to go to private school. So the combination of these efforts is not just about the books. In addition, it really insults our youth, right? Because just like that George Carlin moment that Dr. Beaver was talking about, right? We all had our exploratory moments, and the idea that we need to be protected from ourselves when we're in the school library, right? Schools can't protect us when we go online, and what we go online is a lot more explicit than the 7 dirty words, although that's there too. The reality is that this does nothing to protect children and everything to harm the educational system. Unfortunately, the courts don't get that question in front of them, but I am hopeful that at least some of the courts will be looking at the First Amendment interests of the students in addition to everybody else, because there is a First Amendment right to read, and these extreme laws are undermining that right as well.
Gotcha. Would anyone add to that before I follow up with Dr. Garone's comments and go to the next question? Or okay, good. Dr. Garone, I did read your article that you posted. I think it was metaverse, the educational metaverse, and I thought it was fascinating. And many of the issues that we just raised about, free speech, access to technology, issues of DEI are all embedded in that article. And I'm just wondering if you would expound upon that and whether or not what you propose in that article is realistic, if you will.
So the article, for those, it's posted to the materials. So would be delighted if folks read it. And if you have feedback, love to hear it. So basically, it poses the question about what happens when the metaverse becomes the ubiquitous platform. Right. And by metaverse, what I'm focusing on is an immersive audiovisual spatial computing environment. We're not there yet, certainly, but we are probably 5 to 7 years out from being able to have at least some educational instances look like Magic School Bus. And that, if you think about that as a moment to explore, to be inside the heart, to be inside an atom, I think there's amazing opportunities, and both visualization and AI help do that. But if we go from instances like that to your entire classroom is online moderated, there's a number of concerns that we need to take into account. Again, I'm not against it. I think there's some great use cases, but we need to take them into account. I'll just focus on one here, which is the digital divide. That right, Apple Pro Vision, which I don't think is yet the answer, but it's coming out at $3,500, right? Clearly that leading technology is not for everyone. It's for a very small slice of society. Those people with access to that technology are now going to be the forefront of creating the apps and the games for the next generation. And so each time we put a financial barrier into the development system, we further winnow who has access, who's going to be participating. And if we're talking about public education and huge financial barriers, that has a race, gender, geographic, and other impact that we need to overcome.
Excellent. We have one question left, but we also want to leave a little time for the audience if they had a question and or concern. So while the audience prepare the question, our final question is, what challenges will institutions be addressing in the next few years based on the trends in distance education regarding accreditation? What challenges? Dr. Ravitch, do you foresee any challenges?
Yeah, I do. We're at a point now where many, I don't know how to characterize, are criticizing the value of higher education to begin with. And this compounds that problem. My solution, that's too strong a word, is probably to resort to fundamentals, right? Teaching the liberal arts, teaching reading and writing, so that we're not passive. But schools are at in higher education at an inflection point for sure, in terms of proving their value. And that's going to be even more difficult in a digital age.
Okay. Dr. Pinkert.
Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Ravitch there. And I think one of the questions that persists for me, and this relates to issues of accreditation, comes down to what we assess. And often we assess what we can, right? And so I've led workshops on assessment for accreditation agencies. And we talk about some of those things that you can easily assess, but they may not tell us all that much, right? Or they may not tell us what we really want to know. And then some of those things that are just really difficult to assess. So you asked earlier about creating a culture of inquiry. And I like to use the example in writing studies, we talk about developing habits of mind, right? So it's not only about what you put on the page, but it's about how you become a writer, right? How you learn to ask the right questions. And curiosity is one of those important habits of mind, right? That are a bellwether for success for writers. But as soon as I say, okay, student, demonstrate curiosity, now I'm going to measure it, right? It's no longer curiosity because I just told you to do it and now you're performing it for me. So I think alongside this question, and I have it often about what are we doing in higher ed and what's our value, I think there are also questions about how we measure what's really important to us, and whether we can measure, and to what extent we can measure what's important.
Excellent. Dr. Beaver, any thoughts?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I will just start by saying I'm grateful for opportunities like these because I think these sort of conversations are the future. The division between soft skills and hard skills in technical disciplines, and especially, I think that's a change we're going to see. Seems like a federal push towards embedded interdisciplinary work. And I think UCF has done a good job of starting to reflect that in policies, even around thinking about AI at the institutional level, drawing diverse groups of scholars together to think about the implication of emerging technologies is really important. And again, we're seeing those shifts in federal funding policies, professional standards, and accrediting bodies. So I think that's a challenge we'll see moving forward.
Nice. Dr. Giron, what challenges do you see?
You know, our conversation has really split along two different lines, right? One is the political pressures being put on education. The other is the technology pressures being put on education. And I think we're going to see that play out at the Department of Education and roll down to the accreditation systems as well, right? There is huge political pressure on the Department of Ed and the accreditors on both sides of various political agendas and that's shaping some of the conversations that are going on. There is also I think a split, right? There is a giddiness that we see among technology companies, VCs, and parts of the community about AI, and there is a real fear among other parts. And I think that tension is also going to play out within different accreditors, and which side of the scale a particular accreditor is on may depend based on whether it's a regional or specialty accreditor, and quite frankly, who's on the accreditation team when they show up to your campus. So I think that in the short run, what we're going to see is even more confusion and pressure. And in the long run, I think this is going to reshape the way the Department of Ed operates. Which direction it goes, I can't anticipate.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Again, if you haven't read Dr. Groh's article, I think it's a very interesting read. I was stunned by how many, I guess, younger generational terms he used in that article. And I'm saying, well, I don't have an Oculus, and I don't have this device, I don't watch this and that. But it's all through the article. But it was a very, very well crafted and I would say very beautifully written article. So thank you. And thank you
so
all
much
for being here today. I appreciate your time. I really value being able to reconnect with Jonathan and with Timothy, because we've worked together for a long time. And meeting you, Dr. Garona, is a pleasure, as with you, Dr. Pinkert. So do you have any closing thoughts before we pass on?
Just thank you very much for hosting the conversation. This has been delightful.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you all.
There are several commendations and thank yous coming in the chat, but I want to take this time to thank Lee and the panel for your engagement today. You have given us a lot to think about and to some points that we should pay attention to as we consider how we can become and remain responsible and look at responsible use of technology going forward, especially as we consider the balance of power, not only in our spaces and places of practice, but as a whole in education, because that is where we engage. So thank you for your time today. And I want to say thanks to the audience for remaining with us as we had this conversation. I am going to hand it back over to Vicky to close out this time as we move into the next item on our conference agenda.
I want to thank our speakers. It was amazing to hear what you had to say and the thoughtful consideration to the issues we're facing today. And I'm delighted to hear that you appreciated the opportunity to share your thoughts and to have a discussion, collegial discussion between the group of you. So thank you so much for sharing with us. We're about to move into our concurrent sessions portion of our program today. So please make sure you stay around and listen in on the best strategies and implementation that we can in distance learning today. So thank you very much.